We take a bare metal server and we actually, through network provisioning, basically remapping the server I/O through the network, we can point it at a particular storage image which contains the boot image of an operating system. In one particular point in time, you may decide to boot a server up to a particular boot line, and that boot line has Windows on it. So this server mapped to this boot line. At a different point in time, you may say, take this server and map it over to a different boot line, and that different boot line may have Linux with an e-commerce application on it. So what vFrame does is it remaps all of the network I/O and the server addressing to whatever boot line you want that server to run. And so through a different set of policies, you can change what's running in that server. And that's where the server becomes dynamic. And 3 years ago, we were calling that server virtualization. But what we were finding from customers is that while they like the ability to sort of rapidly provision their servers and centralize all their boot images, they think of server virtualization as this hypervisor technology, i.e. ESX, and the virtualization of the server really is them, creating 5 or 10 virtual machines on the server versus changing in a moment's notice what was running at a boot level on that server.
So what's the benefit by integrating with the ESX? Yeah.
So the benefit is that this is where we sort of get into this layered model. If we're managing the servers at a bare metal and mapping the network I/O, if you will, to a particular set of storage resources as well as client, Ethernet sort of client resources. So we could map the server to VLAN, the firewall, the content load balancer. There's no reason why you couldn't offer this for doing this and loading a server up with ESX. So what we've done is basically VMware doesn't do anything like this at all. They don't really do much management at the bare metal server level. They would leave it up to the customer to go configure through some of their management consoles the ESX load image and how in configuring it to a set of a shared LUN environment, if you will. And there's a fairly complex set of configurations that a user would have to go through. vFrame basically offers a configuration template in which you configure that once, and then for every server you want to add into the cluster, it's a repeatable set of configuration parameters, and so you could load multiple servers up with ESX, all booting from a central set of LUN repositories, and get multiple servers up and running quickly. We do think that there will be a fundamental shift several years out in moving towards more of an embedded ESX model, in as much as customers will want to adopt ESX as their base hypervisor image and then run everything else as a guest OS. Our view is that that's a good attachment model for VMware, but it's not necessarily a model that gives the customers ubiquity and creating a heterogeneous server pool, because then the server is uniquely characterized for VMware. Our model has been that the servers are servers at bare metal, and that by pointing them dynamically at different centralized boot images, you can change what's running in that server depending on what your service needs are.
So far with vFrame, you could only point to Linux and Windows.
Right.
And tomorrow you will be able to point to ESX.
Right. Now ESX it's been a more complicated engineering effort for us because ESX uses what they call a shared LUN model. And what that really means is that the virtual file system of theirs presents a shared LUN to all the virtual machines. But those virtual machines could easily oversubscribe the size of any given physical LUN. So their shared LUN at the virtual file system really means that you have to map multiple physical LUNs behind it. So every time you configure an ESX server into one of their clusters, you have to go configure each one that's made up of, that each physical server each ESX server has to see all of those shared LUNs for it to work in that cluster. So we have built a provisioning template in which you can go describe all of the LUNs you want, quote unquote, in the shared LUN world, and then every time we bring up an ESX server, those LUNs are configured automatically. And that's a derivative work that we had already, that came out of the work we'd been doing because of the way we can point a server across the SAN to a boot image. And so we already knew how to configure LUNs because we're doing that on the fly, and now we know how to configure the shared LUN environment on the data repository side. I think in terms of how server virtualization is being defined now, or the sort of the mainstream view of server virtualization, which is this hypervisor technology, we're interested in complementing that hosting environment, ensuring that the same set of services you would typically get when you hosted something physically, you could now host virtually. So we had built this view that the network can create a dynamic hosting model, in that vis-a-vis the network you can now move towards a utility server pool, and that from that pool you could easily grab a server and bring it up running almost any kind of application environment depending on what your capacity requirements are. And the networking plays a significant role because it has to remap the I/O. So there's some I/O reconfiguration we're doing, and not only do you remap the I/O to the storage, you actually have to remap the I/O to all of the networking services as well. Because typically, if it's an internet server, for instance, you want, as you bring it up running Windows and e-commerce application, you have to do some unique settings for the Ethernet and the virtual LAN and the firewall and the content load balancer as you bring that server online. And that's why customers they don't change their servers around that much, is because it's got a lot of downstream network configurations that they have to sort through. So vFrame basically, provides a single design interface where all of these are designed together as one set of virtual services, and they can be applied dynamically. Now, taking that view and now going back to the VM server virtualization world, the view that we have is that that instead of mapping all of these network services at the physical server layer, once you have the system running the base hypervisor, that ESX, you'll then want to take and add more granular network services as you bring up a VM. Because a VM is equivalent to what was once running on that physical server. So today, most customers aren't very granular with the kinds of network services they're configuring as they bring up a VM.
Right.
So where we're going with the whole provisioning platform is to basically, in the second half of next year, say that when you add a VM onto a hypervisor, you'll have a provisioning interface that you can go into with vFrame vis-a-vis, an API connection with Virtual Connect, and then describe the content load balancing, the firewall, and some of the other network services that you would typically want to associate if you wanted a rich set of networking services.